Distinguished colleagues, good afternoon. We are hosting this session on tax administration, a model for the future. And let me start with a number of basic ideas here. We have Piotr Medvedev from Ernst & Young and Olga Anufrieva, a lawyer from Makarov and Partners Bureau. We work closely with Olga as we develop norms of the tax legislation. She is a great expert in taxation. Olga Chepurina, she is from the government and she is responsible for changing the supervision and control model. On top of that, she is responsible for introducing the models of tax management and administration that was tested in the tax service. And how does the government see the system of supervision and control? Also with us we have Dmitry Volvach, Deputy Minister of the Economic Development. He is an expert in client centricity. This is a new buzzword, or even human centricity, and we're moving moving really fast in that direction. And I got this idea: how could we revise this topic? Or we were preparing the slides for our discussion, and a lot can be explained by the fact that there is this point where you can ensure really fast, explosive growth, where there is lack of investment. You invest into that, and then there's huge leap forward. You create your personal account, you create your feedback system, and then you get this feeling, all right, we have done this, and now what? Shall we not wait for some bright, major breakthrough solutions that we can discuss here at the panel, and rather be honest and say there's still lots of things that we could improve in the system of tax administration in a narrow sense of the word, how the tax service works, and in the broader sense in terms of how all stakeholders interact. And we decided to take a different approach here, and my HR colleagues have shown me what we are as the tax service. And this tax service consists of people who are involved in a certain course. And I asked them to come up with this average portrait of people working at the federal tax service. And on the other hand, they provided this portrait of an average businessman. And this was rather unusual. And these are, on average, we are talking about 37-year-old men and 39-year-old women. And we have around 150,000 employees. We have millions of sole proprietors and companies. And these are the two types of people that interact with one another. When we remove this dichotomy between business and the federal tax service, how do we see this relationship? What do we want to get in the taxation system from those relations? Do we have any complaints or claims against one another? How can we move forward? So I decided to take a closer look at that entire picture, and this is the start of our discussion, where our society, our social groups can go in the future, what kind of results we can get in our society. Tax relations, it's not just between the taxpayer and the tax authority. It's much broader, deeper, requiring careful calculation for years to come. we need to be really careful in what we're doing and how it can hurt the entire country if we are not careful in what we do. When we talk about the future, there are two functions. There is this function of tax administration or control, and there is this function of tax services. Where else can we find something similar? There's a huge disadvantage. The tax service doesn't have any competition in the country, and when you cannot compare yourself with anyone, it's always dangerous. And Piotr here was kind enough to join us here on the stage, and he decided to provide the audit approach to our surveillance function. And we also are sort of auditors. We check companies and look at the results that they get. Where are those development points that we perhaps cannot see at the moment? Good afternoon, colleagues. When I was asked this question, I had to take some time to think about it. The Federal Tax Service treats us as some kind of necessary evil. You have to get audited and try to relax and enjoy it. Our stakeholders expect from us that we do more with fewer resources. We are responsible in front of the clients and the regulators and the financial markets. Our entire job is based on trust, whether people trust us or not, whether financial markets trust us or not. And when I realized that, I understood that this whole topic of trust is the central point in this entire system. It's based on 4 pillars. Number 1 is technology. Number 2, methodology, if it's clear and transparent. Number 3 is culture. Number 4 is honesty and openness or integrity. Technology is where we are advanced. We automated a lot, and in that sense, business trusts this situation that the technologies will give us the result we wanted to. When we introduced robotics and automation into our processes, it's not just for the design of those processes, but also for how we work with our clients so that they understand what we do, why we automated this process in this particular way, and whether their data is safe and things like that. The second area is about methodology. Our entire methodology is based on the risk-oriented approach. And here we have 3 points of view. First of all, it's country risk, where you can use 54.1, and beneficiaries who are owners, or some general topics for the development of the country. The second category of risks are industry-based, whether they recognize or not recognize expenditures or theft at retail. And the third category of risks are the risks of specific taxpayers, and this is something that we analyze as we interact with taxpayers for a long time. We know companies that are more or less aggressive, and and all those skeletons in the cupboard. And where we want to be, we want to have a certain process regarding each one of those risks that we could use to assess the risk and ideally assign a certain number to it. This is about methodology. This is the difference between us and the taxation authorities. We discuss this methodology with the client when we meet them, to make sure that we understand all the risks and to get this atmosphere of trust. The third area, that's probably the most delicate of all the matters. It's about culture. It's how we develop our personnel. There are 250,000 auditors, like a small army, and for each one there are some basic areas that people need to know, accounting and finances, but you also have to have soft skills such as curiosity, flexibility, readiness to work as part of the team, mobility, and being prone to innovations. And we spend on those soft skills just as much time as we do on technical knowledge. What is also important for us, many of those ideas are institutionalized. We have our global code of behavior. It's all about how we work with clients, with colleagues, how we provide them auditing services. As you said, on the one hand, we consult our clients. On the other hand, we check them. And this is a system of checks and balances that helps us here. How we protect data or IP as we do our checks. It's a little simpler for us, I think, because many of our clients are former employees. They went through all this. It's a little simpler for them to trust us. There's this DNA of the tax service. This is friend or foe system is something that we are familiar with. Yes, we do make mistakes, and unfortunately, but as we make mistakes, we always recognize them, and both with the regulator and the client, we come up with a plan on how we're going to correct those mistakes, and we make many of those plans public if it was a serious mistake that requires public attention. If we talk about where we're going, it's forming trust towards us as an institution based on those 4 pillars that I mentioned earlier. And the trust is an integral part of the entire system. It's built in. All right, thank you very much. I planned to carefully approach this topic of trust, but we sort of started with it, and we should have expected that, because this topic of trust is what we really focus on in our team. It's not only what is based on your understanding on how institution works, but it's based on the cultural code. You understand what's good and bad the same way. It's obvious, for me at least, is trust is something that you can accumulate. It's not like it can get there all of a sudden overnight. You may have some generation-based factors, genetics, but this is not something that happens immediately, especially if we talk about such huge systems as the system of tax administration. It's not just about some theoretical things, but it's about what we look at today. And we gradually, seed by seed, need to be planting those seeds of future trust. Instead of arguing, you just have to work together. And when people argue like that, it's not always a civilized approach. Olga is one such person that I could use to take lessons of criticism. She can criticize anyone in such a soft and mild manner that I always listen. I understood from your hints that I have to be even milder. Good afternoon, and I'm glad to see all of you and lots of familiar faces. We have both taxpayers here and the auditors, and together I really enjoy seeing you all here together. This entire function of the Federal Tax Service, you may think it's like an octopus getting more and more functions, but it's a powerful system that helps the government, the state, to move forward and respond to challenges that life puts in front of us. On top of surveillance or control, we need to develop this service-oriented function of the tax service. On the one hand, you make sure there are tax revenues. At the same time, you reduce the costs of both taxpayers and the state. Another matter of concern for me is that we have this sort of division between bona fide and non-bona fide taxpayers. And we say we need to help those who are bona fide, and we shouldn't help those who are not bona fide to pay taxes. But the tax code has been written for all of us. 22 years ago, the presumption of bona fide nature of the taxpayer is still on. Even if a taxpayer makes a mistake and is made liable, they need even more help from the tax authority to not make the same mistake again. And it's not just about dreaming about the bright future and how to get there. I want to understand why we are not there yet. Maybe our taxpayers are wrong. The Federal Tax Service tries to do its best to make sure paying taxes is comfortable and convenient, all those personal accounts with lots of functions. Instead of field checks, we have tax monitoring. One of my colleagues is here, and we worked really a lot on that topic with her. There are lots of services that help taxpayers, and slowly, gradually, we reduce the number of reports, but the taxpayers are still unhappy. There's a huge area of questions. Of course, they all want their fiscal or tax load or burden down, but there are lots of issues related to tax control. Let me get back to the roots. Article 82 of the tax code provides for rules of the three basic rules of tax control. Number one is that tax control should be done by tax authorities. There are details there and nuances, but I'm not going there. The second rule or principle is that the goal of tax control is the activity of tax authorities to control over the compliance with tax and charges legislation. And unfortunately, the auditor believes that the goal of tax control is not compliance with the legislation, but rather ensuring budget revenues.
And unfortunately, sometimes it turns out that the controversy is provoked not by the behavior of the taxpayer, but by how rational is a certain tax accrual. But my point is that tax control should be done according to the procedures set by the tax code. And the tax code is regulating the procedures in a very detailed way. But I, as an attorney at law and as an expert on budget, I learn about some distortions in law enforcement, and sometimes those distortions are so creative that I even start asking myself, people really did that? And sometimes tax authorities can require some documents referring to the Article 31 of the tax code, asking for some very detailed information. There are a lot of questions regarding the non-respect of timeline of tax inspections. Another point of concern for taxpayers is when the tax authorities require information about the justification of using certain prices. It is the Federal Tax Service that should monitor whether prices are in line with the market trends. And they refer to the fact that there are regulations stipulating that this information has to be provided to the Federal Tax Service with some analytics and in a format that would suit the Federal Tax Service, and this is probably not the rightest way to proceed. Yes, indeed, there are a lot of questions, but I would like to point out one matter that has been of concern for me. It is the reduction by 10 times of the number of the field inspections. We do welcome that, but unfortunately it so happens that all of those inspections, actually not all, but the majority of those inspections represent the pre-inspection control, and we would like to see the reduction of the number of those inspections if that would mean that the taxpayer is really left alone, because that would reduce the administrative pressure on businesses, and that is very clear and makes sense. But as part of Article 93, taxpayers are required to submit some documents. As part of some other articles, the taxpayers have to undergo surveys, and information from counter agents is also collected. So once again, it's a mini inspection, but beyond the territory of the taxpayer. And that's a matter of concern for me, because all of that is taking place beyond the procedural framework of the tax code. I think that any contact between the tax authority and the taxpayer should be regulated by law in a detailed manner, so that the rights of the taxpayer are clearly described, as well as the powers of the tax authorities could be described. I am drawing your attention to that because all of that renders the tax administration system non-transparent, because we see a difference between the text of the law and the reality. But I'm closer to the legislator, so I think that this practice and this kind of implementation and enforcement deprives the work of the legislator of its sense. I know that the Federal Tax Service has often conceded some cases of distortion, and I'm very grateful to you, because the Federal Tax Service has been very quick and supporting when it comes to such cases, and they keep abreast of the developments. They are ready to track the work of their colleagues, but I would like to dream a little bit. Of course, we would like to preserve the purity of the tax relations and to ensure that in the tax administration system, I would like tax authorities to serve as an example of a very right and bona fide behavior and respect of law, because the tax authorities require the taxpayers to respect the law. As Peter mentioned, otherwise, the trust that exists between the taxpayer and the tax authority, as well as trust to the objectivity and impartiality of the tax inspector, is lost, and that destroys the whole system of tax relations regulation. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you very much. I see now very interesting internal fight. I thought first that perhaps I could respond to what's been said point by point. And I believe that I just have to accept Olga and her criticism. You know, I think that I could respond to that in a different way. There is no perfection in this world. Otherwise, that would just disappear. So it's maybe good that there is no perfection, but of course we should strive to streamline the operation of the Federal Tax Service and to introduce systems and services that would ensure transparency of the processes, to ensure that there is truth there, and to make sure that we can work out any issue that emerges. Over the time of working in the Federal Tax Service, I made the following conclusion, and perhaps it's not universal, but my point is the following. If I see the world in some way today, it doesn't mean that it will always remain like that. So my idea of what's right and what's wrong has been changing over time, and I've been asking myself whether it's about the instability of my psyche or something, because my view of the world really changed over time. And I remember that I was at the very beginning of the process of Federal Tax Service development, and I tracked the whole process. I remember that at some point I asked myself, are we going now to go against our people? Are we going to blame them and accuse them? So that was a bit difficult for me. Then some new people came and they said, you see, we are losing 60% of cases. Why are we doing that? What's the point? Let us not lose. It's logical, it's cynical, it's clear, okay. Then we said, let's not just not lose, but let's make sure that our work is uniform, because that would mean clarity and precision, which is good. So we decided to take into account the judicial practice, to also work with the Minister of Finance, but we went on losing cases. But still, gradually, we built this certainty in the work of our service. And now we also see some novelties. If people complain, that means that there is an issue, and that means that we do already have some work to do. We don't have to think about what we could improve. We already have some complaints, and we can change something. We can change the processes, we can amend legislation. We have all the opportunities to improve the situation, so why not trying doing that? Then let's have a look at that from the point of view of the executive authorities. These are not yet judicial authorities. what's good and what's bad in this institute. What could be improved? What are the most important things for the government, and how do they see our work and how they believe it could be improved? That's a question to Olga Chipurina. I have always worked with peers. I've never exercised control, even when I worked in the Federal Tax Service. So my goal was to make sure that services are good for the taxpayer. Okay, I get it. You are good, we are bad. Please note that I did not say that. So, as Olga, I'm really happy to see people I know here, but I'd like now to go back to your question. Peter and Olga mentioned building trust-based relationships. This is, of course, a crucial task and it's a priority, but let's be realists. We understand that between the authorities and businesses, especially when it comes to control and supervision, there will always be controversies. We cannot avoid that. We cannot avoid disputes. And we, as the government, have to make sure that the consideration procedures and the whole ecosystem be very fast, effective, and most importantly, convenient and affordable for both sides, both for the state and for the businesses. And we have to respect this balance, as it's very difficult to keep it. Let us now consider things as we are. We are not taking the Federal Tax Service that already has the Judicial Regulation Institute. Imagine that we have conducted an inspection, we have an act, and we have a client. And by the way, I call them clients, not taxpayers. It took me a while to get used to that because I've always been referring to them as taxpayers rather than clients. So imagine that the client does not agree and we start preparing the judicial process, the litigation. There is an attorney at law, a lawyer, consultant, masses of papers, huge time spent. Then we go to court. There is the pre-hearing, the main hearing, then there is the appeals procedure, and the best forecast is that it will last 6 months. And of course, this doesn't suit the government and businesses. This is a very costly procedure for the government because we have to prepare for litigations and so on. And the tax service is not an exception. All the controllers work in the same way, even if they are very diverse. Peter said a very good phrase. It was very easy for us because part of our employees became our clients. It was very easy for us because we were from the tax service, and basically we took the ready-made technology regarding the pre-judicial proceedings, we improved it, and we offered it to the whole process of control and supervision. So now we have the set time for complaints consideration of 20 working days. When we offered this architecture, 99% of controllers said that it was impossible because we have such huge procedures, but still now it takes 20 days. All the interaction takes place electronically. It was very important for us to make it elegant. The state service portal, then 3 clicks there, and businesses told us that it's very important for them to track the progress of their complaint. What happens with my complaint, they said. Allow me to see who considers this, who signs it. So we made it all transparent and put all this information in the personal account on the state services portal, so you can track all of that. Of course, when we voiced this initiative, we realized that we will not be able to implement it overnight. So the pilot project took us 6 months. First, we took 3 agencies. Then we spread this practice upon another 19 agencies, and we set the following goal. First of all, everything needs to be clear and simple for the client. And second, everything has to be clear and simple for the controller or the inspector. The third goal was for us, because we wanted to see a lot of information, but I will speak about it later. So indeed, we made a streamlined interface for the users, and it was more challenging to work it out with the inspectors, because the digital maturity level of different people is very different. Some people are used to working with paper documents, and they were not at all ready to use electronic documents. Some have some elements of automation, but there is a lot of paper-based red tape. And it turned out that there are a lot of agencies that use their own digital ecosystem, and we offered a third option of interacting with us for them. We've been talking a lot about being human-centered, but our employees, our internal clients are also humans. If they don't like the tool we give them, they will never really use it. They will just do everything formally without any practical effect. So it took us around 8 months to streamline the system, and then business told us, okay, it's fine, it's all clear for us. And then internal clients said that they find the system convenient. Only after that, we started implementing the system. The system started operating as mandatory for some kinds of control from the 1st of July 2021. From the 1st of January 2022, we will launch it for the regional inspections and some municipal inspections. And from the 1st of January 2023, it will become mandatory for the federal, regional, and municipal controls. So it will become mandatory for all the out-of-court claim consideration. Why is it good for us? Because finally, for the first time, we saw what Daniel mentioned for ourselves. If people are complaining, then there is a problem, and we have to find out what's the essence of the complaint, who is complaining, and why, and against whom. And we discovered such clusters of complaints. Then we also learned how complaints are considered by inspectors, and how this process is organized within an agency. So we received a lot of information that allowed us to have a more focused approach, more specifically. So we did not have an abstract idea of how to improve the lives of our clients, but we saw what were the pain points. We now have a comprehensive database that allows us to get this information. Of course, we are only just learning to work with this information, but this morning I considered data, and we see that the average time of complaint consideration is 17 days. Remember that it used to be 6 months. So even in terms of that, that's a huge progress. I'm a person that has always been providing services. So what's this procedure for me right now? I received the book Complaint as a Gift from Sberbank in 2016 or 2017, and that's an amazing book. And I think that for the authorities, these out-of-court consideration of complaints is indeed a gift, so that we could make relationships with our clients simpler, more transparent, and higher quality. Thank you very much, Olga. I have to acknowledge publicly here the work of the government. You understand me. I remember when I saw what colleagues did, I took a picture of it and I sent it to my colleagues asking why we don't have a similar system in our agency. I think that this is a very important milestone as well. We have governmental KPIs that for a long time determined that the less complaints there are, the better the operation of the ministry or agencies. I remember that when we introduced the personal accounts, we started receiving huge numbers of complaints because it became more difficult. It became easier to send a complaint. So it took us a while to realize that it's actually good to receive a variety of complaints, but we also have to learn to work with those complaints because we have to actually improve the situation. So now I would like to ask Dmitry Volvach, how can the development of these institutions help our economy to develop? And I'm now speaking not just about the relations with businesses, because when it comes to individuals, for example, they will not start businesses if they don't feel comfortable as individuals. So how do you think, what are the standards that we have to develop? And what are the values that we have to promote in order to improve the comfort of life in our country and contribute to the economic development?
Thank you for this question. It is true, the Federal Tax Service is an example of this highest standard of digital transformation, client transformation, and how it works on its own improvement. If we ever need to change something in the management at the government level, in the governance, we need to take the journey of the tax service as an example. We were able to move forward in all areas, starting from digital transformation. We had a system of pretty convenient services, and now we have completed the creation of environment. Our next step is that the tax service is the generator of new tax modes. Usually, new or old tax modes are generated by business or the legislation authority or business. And here I'm talking about tax monitoring and the self-employed category. This is something that was proposed by the tax service specifically. Tax monitoring, of course, we borrowed some from Europe, but there was also a technology as the foundation of that function. This was developed from scratch by the Federal Tax Service. And there's this self-employed category, and there is nothing similar anywhere in the world. And this is something that they came up with by studying the client experience. This is what the Federal Tax Service learned to do in the last few years. You start with the client service first, start with the client experience first, and then you use all sorts of technical solutions. And then, for the last 5 years, we learned how to really take care of our clients. We didn't even have this kind of mentality or philosophy. Of course, there is room for improvement, but that philosophy is there. I would really like us to keep on using these standards, not just for the showcase situation. Oh, there are other examples of fairly modern approach to digitalization and client-oriented principles, but it will have to become a standard for the entire system of governance in Russia in general. Digitalization, starting the client's journey, the new philosophy of how and what we do when we make government or public decisions. I already mentioned the environment. Now about how this experience is really needed. And this is something that's being done anyway. Many approaches of the Federal Tax Service are gradually used in the system of governance here in Russia. And internationally, you know that the experience of the Federal Tax Service here in Russia for the last 7 years has been really meaningful and impactful. And we offer our partners in other countries to borrow our solutions in tax administration. Strange as it may sound, they do borrow those solutions, and they help them with overcoming crises and making their own systems more sustainable and strong. It's not just the former USSR republics. There's this organization under the World Bank where representatives of the government authorities that are leaders in terms of digital solutions in governance, and Russia is part of that, and the Federal Tax Service solutions will be in demand at that site, at that platform, and they will definitely be borrowing it. And let me conclude by this utopia that I have. Building this big client-oriented government is the way to truly digital democracy. Democracy is not just about election days every other year, but it's when a person can change something for real. They feed their opinion into the system tests it, and then when the critical mass is there, decisions can be made even without the involvement of any officials. I may be dreaming, but we are on that path and we are moving fast. I have this dizziness about the great service that I am in charge of, but we used to have this session on digital technologies, and they talked about the feedback, and this means representing my interests where I can express it electronically. This was a great idea. I never thought about this term, even though the idea itself is very close to me. How do the audit blocks work? When we control something, it's control, not the service. When the auditors do that, commercial auditors, it's a service. That's what we also want, but many of their people used to work for us. That's why we trust each other. This whole story of trust, what is the legal content that we need to use to increase this trust? And again, it's not just for one day, but you have to walk the path if you want to get to your destination. And we are willing to listen to one another at a reasonable level. My question to Piotr: where do we have opportunities for growth? What do we need to change in the norms? What kind of institutions do we need to add for us to be better looking at the situation through your eyes. We're discussing philosophy here, it seems. I'm raising the bar. All right. When there's this gap between statements at this forum, at such forums where in favor of everything that's good, against anything that's bad, and then they get back to their office and they discuss all those gray schemes again. And they get back to their old ways. When there is this big difference between what we hear at forums like this and then what we see in real life, we will not succeed. That's why I keep talking about culture. We can talk about human-oriented or client-oriented approach that you're discussing at your office at Niglina, and when it's understood the same way at the tax inspectorate, it's just a theory. You want to improve the quality of services, making paying taxes comfortable, and at the inspectorate, the principle is if someone pays taxes, let's take even more taxes from them if they're willing to pay. It's all at a reasonable level. We have over 100,000 employees working for the tax service. We cannot expect them all to think the same. Do we need SLAs between taxpayers and the tax authorities, which is not part of the tax code, but just because we think it's right to do? When we're discussing industry risks, how often do we invite industry specialists? When we have some discussions between us and the taxpayers, and they happen because the tax authorities do not understand all the specific features of a particular industry, and this is absolutely understandable. The tax inspector cannot know all the details of how a geologist works at a mineral deposit or mineral resource field. All right, in our opinion, when I am asked a question about changing the tax code, I am always afraid of simplifications. When they try to simplify a document, they make it more complicated. Why don't we think about this? What about using algorithms for the tax code to make sure it can be read by machines? The OECD publication on the tax administration 3.0, it talks about the bright future when two robots in two different countries will be dealing with a specific problem. And if this is where we want to be, then these two bots will have to have the legislation that follows a certain algorithm. We have this huge formula to calculate the excise, and before we start talking about a smart taxation system, we need to deal with some basic issues. We need to make our tax code digital by design. That would be a cool task to do. to me, this entire matter of algorithms is particularly interesting. We're talking about future, and they seem futuristic as we meet with companies and colleagues who work in law or digitalization. I cannot say that we have found some solution or elements of a solution. Intuitively, we understand that this is theoretically possible, but we cannot say that today in the market you can get it and then use it. It's not there. We're open for discussions. We're looking for those opportunities, but at this point we did not see any real thing. As for each individual inspector, I remember laughing at myself. It may seem that our interests are very different, but they also often coincide. When we request certain documents, it's a huge problem. How do we reduce that amount of requests? And it's not because life is so easy for us. And I found a way to get back to what Ola said. I do think that requesting documents is better than doing a field audit or check. But if the pendulum moves to a different direction, we may get back to where we were in the early noughties. This is how history works. When the amplitude is small, it's one thing. And anyway, if we go back to what Piotr says, sometimes your food can be rotten, and sometimes when the food is rotten, it's actually good cheese. And we keep spending time and talking to our colleagues to communicate what we think is right, what we think is valuable. That's why we have so many areas of work. But on top of that, I keep going back to what Olga said, how she tells us we need to improve this or that. You can live a certain time in the most convenient and comfortable way. What are the methods to adjust and correct the situation? What are those most important blocks? How we would be able to do that? Unfortunately, business keeps saying, stop changing the tax code. The tax service is so creative. They want to improve things, they want to change things, but when will we get the results? And I'm not sure we need a new revision of the tax code. For 20 years, I've been working on the upgrade of the tax code. I understand how it works. I understand how much time you need from the idea to its implementation and when it's used in real life. I understand very well that we may, us or someone else, we may write a good tax code and then it's outdated when it is approved. We all understand this. There's no ideal solution. Our life is changing too fast. We get new challenges every day and get new opportunities. What we need to change For sure, I get back to what I already said. I wish I had in the tax code what you mentioned, Daniel. I'm not saying we shouldn't be requesting documents. They have to be requested in according with the law, in accordance with.
That means that all the procedures related to the contact between the tax authority and the taxpayer have to be compliant with the law. There should be no diversity between the rules set by different inspectors. We need clear rules so that the taxpayers understand how they should act, what they should respond to, what are the inquiries to which they should not respond, because we know that sometimes it's not really clear what the authority requires. So it's not just about reducing the number of inspections and we don't want to blame the federal service for that. It's normal work, and yes, we do need those pre-inspection checks. I like very much your idea when you say that the federal tax service should be invisible for the taxpayers. So yes, indeed, one day I would like to reach this state. Another point I'd like to make is that predictability of our tax system, unfortunately, does not depend that much on the tax regulation, but it rather depends on the law enforcement, on the practice. And sometimes this law enforcement practice falls beyond the legislation. I will give a simple example on the property taxes. Taxpayers did not expect that some real estate related facilities will be considered as real estate. Perhaps it is indeed like that, but that would require amending the civil legislation, or I remember that the Russian Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs even offered to go back to taxation of movable property. Another point, which is also beyond the regulatory framework in practice of law enforcement, is Article 54.1, and this can easily be explained because it was our idea to make sure that in our code we do have some principles set out, and we have to pay respect to the Federal Tax Service for the fact that throughout this period of time it has been forming its law enforcement practice, and all the decisions taken according to Article 54.1 have to be agreed with the higher authorities to avoid distortions. A lot of work has also been conducted regarding the last recommendation letter, but actually through this letter we allowed territorial tax services to be autonomous in some of the authorities and to act without supervision of the adults, so to say, in applying Article 54.1. If the tax inspector, with all my due respect, is ready to evaluate objectively the grounds for a certain operation or a certain transaction, not by how it happens in accordance with some business practices, but based on his own idea about how it should be conducted, if he's not ready to do that. Of course, I'm now exaggerating, and I would be reluctant to see that, although I know that there are some examples of such practice. So in such a case, the tax inspector can just tell the entrepreneur how to conduct business. And I will allow myself to make a quote. In 2004, the Constitutional Court wrote about that already in a very concise way. The tax code of the Russian Federation believes that undue harm during the tax control shall not be made. If the tax authorities are using the motives that go against the law enforcement order, then the tax control can turn from the necessary tool of the tax policy into an instrument of oppressing economic autonomy and initiative, restricting too much the freedom of entrepreneurship and the property right. You know, we are now striving to develop the economy as much as we can, and we also strive to increase the number of businesses and entrepreneurs. I believe that using appropriate taxation tools, we can create conditions under which it will be more profitable for the entrepreneur to pay taxes, to cooperate with the state, and to conduct his or her business in a bona fide manner. In conclusion, I'd like to make a small digression, but I believe it's important. It's not probably related that much to tax administration, but let's ask ourselves, why are we paying taxes? Are we consciously financing the state and its activities according to the legislation? Or are we just doing that because everyone's doing that? Or are we doing that for fear of negative consequences for the non-compliance with the tax code? We can answer that question for ourselves individually, but I think that most people will say, or at least think, that they are doing that for fear of negative consequences of non-compliance. And that brings us to the subject of tax culture. And I think that no legislation changes will enhance the tax culture among the population. And the last point I'd like to make is that all the efforts of the Federal Tax Service and the civil society are focused on enhancing the tax culture, then there would be much less problems in tax administration in our country. Thank you. Once again, of course, I would like to think of it. Actually, law enforcement and creation of a legal environment is an element of culture. How are we behaving according to the letter of law, according to the spirit of law, according to culture? The answer is not evident. Sometimes it's better to follow the letter of law to make sure that the institutes work as written and not as they find it good. But sometimes, once everything is streamlined and works well, perhaps it would be better to follow the spirit of law without overcomplicating the legislation that lags behind the change of the reality. Certainty is also an important point, and I'd like you to go back to what you, Olga, said about the property tax or the real estate tax. Colleagues, what have we been expecting? We had the property tax, and it included everything. We can take statistics and see how many disputes on property tax existed before it was changed 2 years ago. Perhaps there were 5 or 6 such cases. Then we said, you know, we don't have any precise norms in the civil legislation, but we are going to impose a tax on real estate, and we are not going to impose the tax on movable property. And the immovable property is the one that is related to particular place. So the question is whether a window is considered to be a non-movable property or a screw. Is it a movable property or not? It's an interesting subject to discuss as part of tax control. So that triggered the development of a whole new area of control. So law does have an impact on disputes, and it will influence the way a dispute will be considered. So are we making taxation non-neutral? If you are making it non-neutral, of course, we should expect risks. Perhaps at some point we will become so mature and so principle committed that there will be no questions. But I believe that as of today, if we can avoid creating risks by non-neutrality, it's better to stick to neutrality. But once again, this is all about trust, because of course everything that we have been discussing could be resolved in a simpler way. The fact that you control that is good, and the fact that you do have some trust is also positive. But once again, it's about finding a balance. You say that it takes a lot of time to conduct an inspection, but if all the inspections are now centralized for the whole country, do you really expect that inspections will be conducted quickly? But perhaps if we act otherwise, that would create problems of trust. So yes, there are issues to resolve. If we act as managers, institutes should also work. It should not be just manual management. If we are conducting a lot of manual work, that means that the institution as such is not yet operational. And once again, a question to the government. Olga, how do you see the work of institutions, and what will help us to build trust? Because it's interesting, we work in the tax service, and if the husband is a representative of businesses and the wife is a representative of a tax service, where will the balance be? And what will help to build trust? What will help us to make another step with each other, towards each other? You know, Olga went back to history a little bit, and I would also like to tell you a story. Recently, I had to go to my electronic archive, and I found a presentation of 2014-2015 for one of the Mikhail's international trips. And I read this presentation and I saw the slide that seemed to be very relevant for me today. I tried to remember the words on that slide. These were the requirements or the wishes of taxpayers towards the tax administration system. There were just 3 of them. The first one, clear rules of conducting business with clear, transparent and affordable procedures. The second requirement, rules should correspond to contemporary reality. And the third wish is for those rules to be predictable. So there were those 3 challenges back in 2014, and I saw the presentation and I thought, oh God, these are actually our challenges as of today for us as government when conducting the control and supervisory system reform. I will try to illustrate that. This reform is seems to be endless. It's been conducted for a long time, and that's normal because life changes. And it consists of 2 pillars. The first pillar is related to rules of business, that is to say, the mandatory requirements that businesses should stick to. They should be clear, transparent, predictable, and correspond to reality. The second pillar are procedures and ways to control compliance with those procedures. And this is the second important pillar, and this is something Olga was referring to. She told, please pay attention to that kindly. So there are those two pillars that are related as yin and yang. If we have clear rules, but if they are not convenient, if they take a lot of time, and if the control procedures are cumbersome, that will nullify all the efforts of the state. So if one of the components fails, the whole sum fails as well. So what did we decide to do about that? I would like to highlight that what I'm talking about is not really related to the Federal Tax Service, because it withdrew from that project in an elegant way at some point, and we are now waiting for you to join us back. But as a system, as a model, as an institution, I believe that it is right, and sooner or later we will get there. So the first pillar regarding the mandatory requirements. What have we done? Since 2019, we've had the project of regulatory guillotine, when all the unnecessary things are just cut off and the new, more appropriate ones are approved and established instead. So we created task forces for all the economic sectors, and those task forces consisted of business people, of members of business communities, representatives of the federal executive authorities, and they acted as a fine particle filter to identify the really clear and adequate requirements. And then businesses confirmed that those requirements are clear and transparent for them. And after that, those requirements were published once again. And we had to maintain a constant balance between, on the one hand, not being too rigid, and on the other hand, providing for the interests of the state, of the citizens, and of businesses. This is a very fine balance, and we really moved on the edge. As a result, we cancelled 12,000 legal acts with mandatory requirements, and we adopted only 450 instead. But the system is very slow, and we understand clearly that if we don't establish a framework that would be rigid, in 1 or 2 years, inspectors and controllers will start re-implementing those mandatory requirements. So at the legislative level, we restricted the implementation of mandatory rules. So we really set a perimeter for them. We said what are the cases in which requirements have to be and can be introduced. We established the timeline. We also try to ensure predictability for businesses. Now those requirements can be only introduced 2 times per year, in March and in September, and the legal act has to be published 90 days before it enters into force, so that businesses could prepare. And every 6 years, controllers have to revise those requirements to see whether they are relevant and whether they actually helped to reach the established goals. So for the sake of mandatory requirements, we made clear, simple requirements. I cannot say that they are very affordable for businesses as of today, so we do have some room for improvement. These are clear algorithms according to which businesses will follow those rules. That's the first stage of work. The second stage is more complex. It is related to procedures. I'll try to illustrate that using a specific example and metaphors. Imagine that I'm a restaurant. I prepare salads, pizza. I may be big or small. Sometimes the Federal Tax Service come to see me more often. It's Rospotrebnadzor, Fire Service, Technical Supervisory Service, and they are cool guys because indeed all of those aspects as the quality of food, cooking need to be inspected, but all of them follow different rules. And the restaurant owner has to hire lawyers in order to try to understand that system. And we asked ourselves whether we can standardize all of our controllers and establish standards for them. For example, if you conduct an inspection, here is a list of rules. If you conduct a visit, here is a list of rules, and so on. As a result, we understood that we can do that. Then we set it into a standardized procedures of control to make sure that businesses understand why inspection may take place, how it will take place, and when. Many people are now saying that we're shifting the focus from inspection to pre-inspection check in case of the tax service.
Depending on what risk group you are in. That work is quite complicated. First, we came up with that framework law, and then we had to change the entire legislation for the industry to make everyone fit into that clear structure. By July, we finished that, and now we are working on the agency instructions so that it's all uniform for the controllers. And this is the digitalization age. We understood it would be easier for us to exercise control if we had the uniform analytical system. We have this register of control and surveillance actions, and the prosecutor's office is in control of that. We had long debates whether another agency or ministry should be doing that, but we eventually decided that the prosecutor's office should be doing that because they accept every step in control and supervision or surveillance. You want a check, conduct an audit or check? Yes, this is the checklist, but the prosecutors say, yeah, there is a risk here for life and health of individuals. Do that. It's not an easy process, but this acceptance procedure goes to the database, and we can see who goes where and how often. We are just learning to use that, and I really enjoyed what Daniel said in terms of his references to cheese, and in control and supervision we have everything that you need to cook soup, and then we have the recipe, and we just need to start cooking. I was thinking about borscht, actually. Borscht and pancakes. It may go wrong in the beginning, but if we speak about predictable rules of the game, we have already set the foundation for that. And I think that business should hear this signal, and they did hear it. We talk about trust. This is the first bridge to a new situation when we say we have the rules, we have the procedure. If we still get the bad practice, we can get this feedback and settle some of the matters before it goes to court. Olga and I are debating this important topic, and it's worth it, I think. It's the clash between two schools of thought or two opinions. I think if we talk about risk management, introducing a universal institution for everything at once is quite risky. It's a high level of danger. I truly think that. On the other hand, the institutions that were formed in the first part of the tax code on the procedures and how to do that. These procedures were developed and they cost the authors some sweat and blood, and they were fighting for every paragraph and law and norm, whether you like it or not. These are the norms that have certain history. This is not something written from scratch. At least they require respect. We cannot erase them in just one day, and this is what we are discussing with Olga. There are all these different nuances and details. On the other hand, we should have said, let's make taxes as we do in other countries. In every individual region, we have all these specific taxes, tax inspectorates. We have come up with a unified system, and now we are harvesting the fruit of this universal system of managing taxes. Why is Olga's idea worse than our approach? We have an opportunity to discuss things and compare. What about tax monitoring? We would never get it had we not had the opportunity to make our own decisions. Are we going to set those institutions in stone? Maybe it's okay if we set them in stone. Maybe there's too much creativity. In spring and in autumn, you make amendments when mental patients get their situation deteriorated. And we can always check whether we're doing the right thing or not when we look at the economy. What takes place in the particular industry which we tax? It will be getting worse there, and other people will come and be making other decisions. Now my question is to Dmitry. You represent the ministry which is responsible for the economy. Do you see it in the same way? What do we expect from us as controllers from the point of view of people who are responsible for the economic results of the work of the executive authorities? Thank you for this delicate presentation and refined presentation. Today is the Financial Expert Day. We have the budget on the one hand, but at the same time we have the economy, and both should be developed. When I talk about service culture in governance, I also asked myself, is this about economy or not? At the government level, they had this concept of frontal breakthrough strategies, and you had to calculate ROI and period of when the investment will be returned, and until 2025, 2030, we had all those plans. And our client-centric culture is also about economy. There are calculations that show direct correlation between our individual functions. For example, targeted support to the population, primarily families with children. There was this targeted approach that worked really fast, and we reduced poverty by 10%. by those particular payments that will be made. When we talk about 2030, it can give us up to 0.5% of the country's GDP if you organize the work correctly and deliver it to those who really need it. Second example, in the national development goals, one of the indicators is the increase in the number of employed in the SMEs, and we're talking about 2 or 3% of the impact of that client culture that allows us to create jobs in SMEs. These are small examples, and the biggest prize there is about trust. Piotr started this and this discussion, and that was absolutely correct. How does trust contribute to economic growth? There are several types of trust. You have institutional trust, when it grows or not between the society and the government institution. And I'm talking about government in the most general sense of the word, not just certain ministries, but any institution. There are serious studies and economic modeling that has shown that the growth of the number of people or share of people who trust the government by 1 percentage point would lead to 0.6% of growth of the satisfaction of the population. Until 2030, you can get 3 to 6% additional investments per capita by growing trust by just 1%. And this is one of the key indicators for the development of the economy. When we talk about client-centric approach and how this client culture impacts the growth of GDP, here a study has been done that says that if we increase the number of people who trust other economic agents, including government, by 10 percentage points, will lead to the increase of the GDP by 0.5 percentage points. And 0.5% is a huge benefit that we just have to fight for. Please show my next slide. This is the study about different countries. If in which one of those countries 50% will say that they trust other economic actors, you see the growth of the GDP in percentage points and in billions of dollars. It means that all those who are on that list should be growing, and they have from 10 to 37% of trust at the moment when this study was done. And these percentage points of the GDP and the billions of dollars that should get back to the economy by improving the culture of governance and the trust of the economic actors to each other and the government, this is the prize that we should be fighting for, because we have all components for victory. We have high-tech maturity of global level. We have this excellent school, and let me give you an example of the Federal Tax Service and other authorities that are approaching those standards. They can go through it quicker than we can today, and we have this desire to change this client centricity, introduce it in the governance, and it means we have all the opportunities to impact the economy by doing this work. I really tried to be a good host, but a good moderator, but we need to wrap this up. It's not really funny we really have room for improvement, to put it mildly. And perhaps it's good that we are a bit scared, because we are responsible for our country and our economy by how we do our control and supervision. These are very serious things that can impact our future and the future of our children. Raise your bar, and it will. It's not like you can be successful in one small thing and then bad in another thing. It depends on what you do regularly. Culture is about what you do regularly. It's about how you brush your teeth. And our next point that we always discuss at the service, we started to discuss the history of culture, how introduce culture into the work of the tax service, and what kind of values we have there. It's also complicated. Why is it about the tax service? Because someone once decided that the tax service should be there. If we talk about taxes in our country, and they could have appoint the accountant as tax inspector in every organization, then how we would be talking about the tax service and the culture at the tax service. The history is much broader, and you cannot invent separate values outside of the society where you live. Theoretically, it's possible that they will hardly survive. And my second question, what are values? Is this something easily replaced? It's one person's team, then another person's team. Can they really grow like that? We have to be in this state of always searching, always looking, and what we are, what we want to get in our society. Why do we talk about the global agenda? Everyone is discussing the carbon tax because the day after tomorrow we will have this emission tax. Check yourself, and what I do with myself. What kind of tax are we talking about? Is this our response, cunning response to the West, or do we really believe in the value of environment? Are we really trying to provide incentives to leave something useful for the next generation? It's impossible without culture or without trust. So we will devote the remaining time to not answering the question what, but rather answering the question how. And that's going to be the topic of our panel discussion next year. Thank you.